I learned what betrayal sounds like before I ever saw it. It's the hush inside a quiet house, the soft click of a bedroom door, the sweetness in a daughter-in-law's voice when she thinks no one is listening. It's the words 3 million an old woman drifting down a stairwell like frost. And it's the look on a husband's face, my husband's when he adjusts his shirt, sees his wife standing in the foyer with Christmas gifts in hand, and realizes the performance is over. The December cold was still on my cheeks when I set those presents on the entry table and called out the way I always did an ordinary grandmother dropping off early gifts. I was 62, still stubborn about satin ribbons and proper wrapping paper, a habit my mother had braided into me years ago. David's car wasn't in the driveway. His caseload at the firm kept him until well after 7 p.m. most nights. I didn't expect him. I did expect Cleo to at least shout a hello. Instead, her voice coiled from upstairs bright and crisp. "The 3 million will be ours soon enough," she said. "Clark says the old woman won't last much longer." The blood left my hands, and for a heartbeat the banister was the only solid thing in the world. My Clark had a key to our son's house, and the woman speaking so lightly about my death was the wife David had begged me to give a chance. I took one step toward the kitchen, feigning bustle as footsteps descended. They came down together. Cleo in a fitted top and that careless smile she wore like perfume, Clark, tugging his cuffs into place, silver hair combed back. The same man who kissed my forehead every morning at 7 a.m. and asked if I wanted cinnamon in my coffee. His face went white. I said the only sentence that didn't tremble, "I brought the Christmas presents." Cleo's smile smoothed a practiced seam. "Clark just stopped by to help me move furniture," she sang, "because David's so busy." The lie was shaped to fit the moment, but the knots in Clark's tie told another story. He muttered about errands and slipped past me without a kiss on the cheek, leaving the air behind him, smelling like guilt and cologne. I drove home through streets that had looked festive on the way there and now felt like props on a fake stage. The house Clark and I had bought when our hair was darker and our future brighter didn't feel like a home when I unlocked it. It felt like a set built for a woman whose role had been rewritten without her consent. I stood in the hallway touching the frames of David's childhood, the school portrait with the crooked tie, the lacrosse photo with scraped knees, and understood that my life had been moved 2 inches to the left, and no one thought to tell me. At breakfast the next morning, Clark said I looked tired. "See, Dr. Morrison," he advised, stirring sugar into my coffee with unusual attentiveness. He mentioned sleeping pills. The suggestion slid across the table, deceptively gentle. I smiled and said I'd think about it. I watched his eyes for the flicker behind the concern and saw it there, a small, hard spark that didn't belong to the man who once danced with me in the kitchen at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. Over the next 2 days, solicitousness became a performance. He brought me tea unasked, suggested afternoon naps, and raised the idea of reviewing our insurance policies as casually as one mentioned spring bulbs. It would have sounded responsible to anyone else. To me, it rang like a bell. That afternoon, Cleo called and invited us to dinner on Saturday. "Family business," she said. "Wills and estate planning, nothing urgent." I told her we'd be there. Then when the house emptied and Clark left to help David with the yard, I went to my husband's desk and opened the bottom drawer. His handwriting has always been tidy, the kind of script that won spelling bees. The folder tucked beneath old tax returns contained photocopies of our investment statements and insurance, plus a page where he had added neat columns. Life insurance, $500,000. Investments, $2.8 million. House, $400,000. Total, $3.7 million. Beneath it, he'd scribbled later in smaller letters, as if ashamed of the sentence even as he wrote it. Natural causes, heart attack most likely. History of hypertension. No autopsy if handled correctly. The chair met me before the floor did. I took a trembling photo of the page with my phone, slid everything back where I'd found it, and stood in the doorway of our bedroom until the room steadied. That evening, I cooked pot roast with the little potatoes he loved. He kissed my cheek and told me it smelled wonderful. Later, he brought up Saturday's dinner as if it were a kindness, tidy paperwork, clear beneficiaries, no complications later. The way he said complications made my skin prickle. I lay awake beside him, listening to the even hush of his breathing, and understood I was married to a man who had put a price on my life. Friday at 10 a.m., I walked into a small office on the other side of town and hired a private investigator. Marcus Chen wore wire-rimmed glasses and the patient look of someone who sees the worst and still believes people can choose better. I played him the recording in my head and showed him the photo of the note. He didn't say dramatic words. He just nodded and asked me to act normal, to be careful with anything I ate or drank, and to let him work. That afternoon, I followed Clark's car to a downtown hotel and watched with the clinical detachment of someone whose heart had flipped to its survival setting as my husband and my daughter-in-law stepped out together, heads bent, close her hand on his sleeve. She kissed him in the cold daylight. I drove home, washed my face, and set the table for dinner. On Saturday, I wore the blue dress Clark always complimented and the pearl earrings he gave me on our 20th anniversary. If this evening was a stage, I would at least choose my costume. At David's door, my son hugged me, the way he always had, his warmth an anchor I almost clung to. The dining room glowed with candles. The manila folder lay beside Clark's plate. When the papers slid across to me, I asked for my own lawyer to review them. The room cooled by 10 degrees. David, bless him, called it wise. Cleo's smile thinned. I had stepped off their map. For the first time since that stairwell, I felt my pulse slow. I would not be an easy woman to disappear. Marcus called me at 8 a.m. on Monday with the kind of careful tone that prepares you for a wound. He confirmed what my stomach already knew and added jagged edges I hadn't imagined. The affair wasn't a lapse, but a schedule. 2 meetings a week at the Marriott for almost 2 years. He had timestamps, parking tickets, and a doorman who nodded with grim recognition when he showed photographs. Worse, he'd traced a river of gambling debts snaking out from our joint accounts and into hands that do not send polite reminders. More than $400,000 owed to men who discuss repayment with their fists. My husband's tidy penmanship had been the polite surface over a sinkhole. Marcus's final detail left splinters. Cleo had been working on David as meticulously as she had worked on Clark, curating missed calls, redirecting visits, and offering him doctored screenshots that made me look petty or disapproving. She was writing a story about me and giving my son the paperback. I hung up and stood at the kitchen window while the kettle hissed. Love and fury sat side by side in my chest, 2 wary houseguests who did not speak. I decided with the same stubbornness that keeps satin ribbons in drawers for decades that I would not lose my son to the story they'd crafted. That afternoon, Cleo called with a honeyed invitation to dinner on Wednesday and asked almost as an afterthought if I might bring the wine I'd served last Thanksgiving. I said I would, and ended the call with my hands so steady they surprised me. On Wednesday, at 10 a.m., I walked into a private lab Marcus recommended and slid a new bottle of the same vintage across the counter to a technician named Dr. Park. She explained test panels and timelines with brisk compassion and advised me kindly, firmly to go to the police. I told her I would soon. What I didn't say was that sometimes survival requires choreography. In the parking lot, I switched the tested bottle for an identical one I'd purchased separately and labeled both in my purse so I wouldn't betray myself with a glance. That evening, Clark drove to David's house, humming a tune from the radio, glancing at his watch, as if punctuality could absolve him. David's hug wrapped around me the way it had since the first day he toddled into my knees. Cleo floated in, wearing a black cocktail dress that read, "Celebration more than family pasta," and her eyes lit when she saw the bottle. She fussed with the label, complimented my taste, and carried it to the kitchen. I sat in the living room and felt like a woman in a painting pretending to be alive. When the glasses arrived, everything slowed. Clark raised his immediately. David took a normal sip while describing a case that sounded like a parable I didn't want him to live in, and Cleo barely moistened her lips, a butterfly kiss of verification. I lifted mine, let it touch my mouth, and set it down. 10 minutes later, I let my fingers brush my temple, let my breath shorten, let my shoulders sag. The performance wasn't melodrama, it was self-defense, and it worked. Concern shaded David's voice. Eager reassurance softened Clark's. Cleo's pupils tightened the way a sprinter's do at the gun. I excused myself to the bathroom, practiced my pallor in the mirror, and returned with a faint smile and a careful stumble. We ate lasagna. I took bird bites and praised the sauce. Clark murmured about doctor's appointments. Cleo ushered the evening along with the patience of a spider who believes its web is already sealed. Back home, Clark suggested a movie and chose something we used to cry over. I sat beside him and watched a fictional husband hold his wife's hand with devotion, while a real husband calculated angles beside me. When he fell asleep at 11 p.m., I lay awake until the ceiling softened into gray, and I could hear the newspaper land on our porch, like the daily testimony of routine. Thursday at 9 a.m., I walked into Patricia Simmons's office, a place where the air smelled like lemon oil, and the walls were lined with other people's preserved intentions. I told her the truth in a level voice. She did not gasp. She laid out options. By noon, my will was rewritten with conditions sharp enough to cut through future lies, naming David as sole beneficiary, while excluding Cleo under any shadow of involvement or sudden reconciliation. We established a living trust that locked Clark out of the accounts he had treated like a private casino. We compiled a sealed letter that documented everything we had to be opened if anything unexpected happened to me. When I signed, the pen didn't tremble. It felt like a key turning in the right lock. From there, I drove to the university hospital and met Dr. Sarah Chen, a cardiologist with calm hands and the same clear eyes as her brother. I told her I needed medical truth on paper. By late afternoon, I had printouts that said my heart was strong, my blood pressure steady, my cholesterol excellent. She looked me in the eye and said that if my heart stopped suddenly in the next weeks, it would be suspicious. I slipped the reports into a folder and pressed my palm against them, the way one might press a palm to a window during takeoff, a simple human gesture to steady what's lifting. That evening, Clark studied the prescriptions Dr. Morrison had written that morning, the increased blood pressure medication, and the little sedative to take the edge off like a chef admiring new knives. "You should start tonight," he said, the concern lacquered just enough to shine. "Maybe tomorrow," I answered. His jaw ticked once. Later, behind his office door, he made a low call that carried up the stairwell in shards. "Won't take it. Suspicious. Might need to accelerate." The words found me like cold water and woke something I had kept for years, the iron I'd used to get through lean months, to survive grief, to raise a boy into a man. I texted Marcus and told him we were moving to the next step. He asked for a time. I said noon Friday. He replied that he would be ready. Friday morning, Cleo called with sudden cheer, proposing a girls' day and steering hard for a quiet lunch. The eagerness bled through. I agreed, picturing the table, the angle to the door, the reach to my purse, where the recorder would sit, and the wire beneath my sweater would hum. When I hung up, I looked at my reflection, at the face they had labeled "old woman," and felt neither shame nor fear. I felt focus. They had written a script for me. At noon, I intended to hand it back. The restaurant was one of those new places with wide windows and tables spaced like polite strangers. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a seat that faced the entrance, and the street beyond where I knew Marcus's unmarked car would be waiting. My pulse was steady. I'd spent the morning packing my purse, like armor recorder copies of Clark's note medical reports and the letter for David sealed in an envelope labeled "Only Open If." When Cleo walked in at exactly 12:05 p.m., she looked like a magazine-spread cream coat, perfect waves of hair, the faintest scent of jasmine and ambition. She smiled wide enough for the entire room to see. "Norma," she said brightly, "you look wonderful. I was worried about you after Wednesday night. I'm feeling stronger, I said, letting warmth into my voice. Thank you for suggesting lunch. We don't get enough time, just us. She relaxed, pleased with herself, and settled opposite me. The waiter appeared, and she waved him away with a graceful flick. I've already ordered us a bottle of that Pinot Grigio you love. I hadn't mentioned loving any wine, but I nodded. How thoughtful, I murmured. When the bottle arrived, I watched the ritual. The waiter poured, she tasted, approved, and then filled our glasses. Her hands didn't shake. She had done this before. To family, she said, lifting her glass. To family, I echoed and touched the rim to my lips without drinking. We talked about Christmas plans, gifts for David, her newest interior design client. She was brilliant at pretending the air between us wasn't made of poison, but every few minutes her gaze flicked toward my glass like a cat watching a mouse. After 20 minutes, I excused myself to the restroom. In the hallway mirror, I touched the tiny microphone taped beneath my sweater, then called Marcus. It's happening, I whispered. She put something in the wine. He said the officers were ready and waiting. 10 more minutes, I told him. I want her to say it out loud. When I returned, she was checking her phone nerves, peeking through her perfect facade. I smiled and sat down. Everything all right? I asked. Oh yes, she said lightly. Just waiting to hear from Clark about something. Waiting to hear that I was dead, most likely. I picked up my glass and turned it slowly between my fingers. Cleo, I said softly, can I ask you something? She smiled, curious. Of course, Norma. I met her eyes. How long have you been planning to kill me? The color drained from her face so fast I almost pitied her. Almost? I don't know what you mean, she stammered. 2 years, I continued conversationally. That's how long you've been sleeping with my husband, how long you've been stealing from me, how long you've been researching poisons that mimic heart attacks. She started to stand, but I kept talking, calm and deliberate. You know what the funny part is, Cleo? You could have had everything by asking nicely. David and I would have helped you, but you wanted more. You wanted to erase me. She sat back down, her mask cracking. You're a crazy old woman, she hissed. No one will believe you. Oh, they'll believe the lab results, I said, nodding toward the untouched glass between us and the recordings. The bank records. The note Clark wrote in his neat little hand. Her eyes widened, panic blooming. Then she snapped, voice low and vicious. You should have just died quietly. It would have been easier for everyone. Easier for you, I corrected. You and Clark. She laughed, suddenly sharp and brittle. Clark, he's pathetic. A week-old fool drowning in debt. I never loved him. I needed him to get to your money, nothing more. And David, I asked quietly, do you love my son? Her smile twisted. David is useful, a successful lawyer with a bright future. But if something were to happen to him after I inherited your money... She shrugged that elegant, heartless gesture. Accidents happen. Something in me, something maternal and ancient, rose up then. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small black recorder, still blinking red. Thank you for clarifying, I said. It makes this easier. Her mouth fell open. You've been recording me. Not just me, I said, nodding toward the window. The officers outside have been listening for the last 10 minutes. Sirens flared faintly through the glass. Cleo turned frozen as police approached the door. This is entrapment, she hissed. No, I said softly. This is justice. The next moments unfolded in sharp clarity, the officers stepping in the clatter of a chair, the shock on nearby diners' faces as Cleo was handcuffed. She screamed my name, called me every word her tongue could find. I sat still, watching the performance end. By the time I reached home, Clark was already in custody. Marcus had delivered every document, photo, and recording. It was over. The police statement took hours. When I walked out of the station, the December sky had turned a bruised violet. For the first time in weeks, I breathed without tasting fear. The hardest part came the next morning. I drove to David's office. Detective Rodriguez had beaten me there. I saw her leaving as I entered. David sat at his desk, papers spread before him, his face drained of color. When he looked up and saw me, his composure broke. "Mom," he whispered, and then, "I'm so sorry." I crossed the room and held him. He sobbed into my shoulder the way he had when he was small and scraped his knees. She showed me messages he said between breaths, screenshots. She made me believe you hated her, that you hated me. "I would never," I said. "You're my son, David. My happiness has always been tied to yours." The months that followed were a slow undoing of the damage. Clark pled guilty to attempted murder and fraud, 25 years, effectively a lifetime at his age. Cleo refused to plead. The recording sealed her fate life without parole. The trial was public, brutal, and mercifully quick. When the judge pronounced the sentence, I didn't cheer. I just exhaled. Justice rarely feels like victory. It feels like the absence of fear. David divorced her within the month and moved in with me while he sorted through the debris of his life. We learned to cook together again, watched old movies, even laughed, hesitant, at first, then real. 6 months later, I sold the house that had once been my prison and bought a small cottage on the Maine coast. The ocean there never lies. It simply moves, constant and honest. David visited often, and one summer evening he brought a woman named Sarah, who worked at the animal shelter. She smiled with kindness instead of calculation, and when I saw them together, something in me finally unclenched. On my 64th birthday, as the sun folded itself into the horizon, David took my hand and said, "You saved my life, Mom." I looked at the waves and thought of everything I'd lost and everything I'd found again. "You don't need to thank me," I said. "Protecting you is what mothers do." The sea kept breathing its endless rhythm, and I understood what freedom truly sounded like. No secrets, no scripts, just peace. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Your stories matter more than you think.